Chilling tales for dark nights.
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and Chilling Entertainment are proud to present Otis Gyrie starring in Walking in the Dark.
Every story has a beginning, and every story has an ending. For you, this is just the beginning. But for some souls, their ending will lead them into a journey, a final journey. And that journey's first steps will take them walking in the dark. But don't worry, there will be a guide. But he is just a shadow of what is to come. Prepare to be thrust into another's perception. Through their eyes, you will experience the beginning of the end.
Well, hello there. It's a troubled night. It's going to be a long one, too. I suspect you are wondering why you are here. Well, come, take a walk with me. You see, there's no nice way to say this, but you're dead. I know you don't believe it, but you are. You see, that last cut you were making to that giant pine hit a knot. And when the blade kicked, well, it flew back on you and you were injured. The cut wasn't fatal, but, and this will be hard to hear, the tree just could not withstand the damage from your saw and it fell onto you. Unfortunately, the logging company was not permitted on the land your crew was working on, so minimal effort was made to report the incident by the on-duty first-line supervisor, and time wasn't your friend. You have to get it together. I don't have time to explain much, but if you'll follow me, I have a way to make the journey seem like nothing at all, and we'll be there before you know it. Where are we going? Well, there are choices to be made, and maybe along the way you can decide what path you wish to take. You'll see what I mean. But let's begin. These woods only get darker. What happened to you reminds me of a story I once heard. Old man I used to know, old Joshua was his name. He would spin proverbs and, anyway, this tale may help you understand. You're going to bankrupt me. Is that your goal here?
Richard, relax.
Whose side are you on anyway?
Richard, don't worry about that. We'll work something out. They don't have a leg to stand on. It's just a matter of letting due process take its course.
Then what? I sell the land to pay your legal fees, and I've achieved nothing. Kind of defeats the purpose.
Hang in there, man. Things will come around before you know it.
Yeah, well, I'd feel better if I could at least get these nut jobs off my land.
Patience, Richard. Don't push these guys. You have the law on your side, but they'll sue at the drop of a hat. Don't give them an excuse. They're not hurting anything.
Except my peace of mind. Oh, and they might just bring about the end of the world.
Oh, come on, Rich. Let it go. When this is over, we'll leave enough boot prints on their asses that they'll be looking forward to the apocalypse.
They already are. That's a problem. Look, I gotta go. I can't afford to keep talking.
I'm not charging for this, Richard. Just an update.
Well, thanks for that, but I mean my phone bill. I'll be in touch.
Bye, Richard. Hang in there.
The phone clicked off. Richard sat listening for a dial tone, then realized that he hadn't heard a dial tone in years. Longing for better days, he mused, looking at his cell phone. The blinking time indicator said 23 minutes. He'd been talking for 23 minutes and hadn't learned anything new. Stupid lawyers and stupid technology. That phone call was going to cost him. Anytime minutes don't exist when you're as far outside of the network as Richard's ranch, the phone had to relay off of military towers to reach the corporate grid. He didn't know if it cost the phone company anything, but they sure enjoyed charging him for it. Richard looked out the picture window and across his front acreage. He could see the tree with the white van parked under it. They had built a small fire, a cautious distance from the tree, of course, and were huddled around it despite the heat. At 200 yards, it was hard to make out what they were doing, and the heat-distorted air between them made whatever it was look as unsettling as it was annoying. They looked like they were acting out a play, except the mirage made them warble like those floppy-armed tube creatures in front of car dealerships. Richard tried to look away and go about his business, but he kept seeing them from the corner of his eye, stark white clothes standing out against the pale desert background. This wasn't retirement. This wasn't isolation. How come all the crazies in the world always found a way to ruin everything? Richard forced his eyes away from the window and cursed at the cultists who invaded his golden years. Then he threw in a few choice words for the olive tree as well. He wasn't the type for cursing, but he'd been doing it a lot lately. A bowl of dirty-looking gray fruit, ostensibly olives, but not really, loomed on the counter in front of him. He cursed and looked away from those too. Dust kept up around his boots as he stormed toward the tool shed. He didn't squint in the sun anymore. He'd grown used to the glare. But he kept a hand over his brow to preserve at least a little dark vision to check the shed for rattlesnakes. He felt a length of uncombed hair brush the top of his fingers. It was bristly and thin, sun-bleached in a way that turned his tired gray into a manly, or at least folksy, silver. Life had come back to him since he had moved 30 miles from nowhere. Emphasis on had. He felt age creeping up on him again in the last couple weeks. Quiet and honest, a perfect retirement, he grumbled. No rattlesnakes. Richard tried to feel happy about that, but he secretly kind of wanted to beat one with a shovel just to make himself feel better. It wouldn't have, though, and he knew it. Cutting down the tree, on the other hand, might. He pulled the single-horsepower chainsaw off the wall. The 14-inch chain, which seemed like more than enough to cut away dogwood and sagebrush, seemed pitifully small against the girth of the olive tree, but it would do. The distant rumbling sound of an engine floated into the shed, carried on the dry breeze. Richard stepped back outside to see the twin plumes of dirt billowing from behind the tires of a city driver going too fast on the incoming dirt road. He smiled and put the chainsaw back on its peg. Even better, he thought. The professor arrived first, but the deputy was only a short ways behind. Then Whitney Whittle, the face of Evening 5 News, arrived, looking as worn out as Richard.
"Can I talk to you when we get a second?"
Whitney asked him in a whisper. Richard nodded briefly, and Whitney seemed to rejuvenate a little. "So, who have we here?" A middle-aged man with an Atlanta Hawks ball cap, ringed with sweat and collecting dust, bowed over so slightly and wiped a sweaty palm on his khakis. "Dr. Adnan Beljovic, University of Georgia, Athens," said the professor, shaking the smiling anchorwoman's hand. "Dr. Beljovic is a premier dendrologist," Richard said. "Flew in just for this." "You don't say," Whitney smiled. "Well, I'm not surprised. This special little tree of ours is gaining national attention. That's part of what I wanted to talk to you about, Richard. Today America called and wanted to send a correspondent. I told them we'll see how today goes, but this scoop is mine, so they'd better get in line." She smiled again, but it was terse. She knew that today could go anyway, good, bad, or terrifying. "How sporting of you," Richard said. "I can't believe you still want this story, though, after— Oh, now more than ever," she replied. The professor began untying a gray box full of gear from the roof of the Jeep while the deputy looked around suspiciously. His eyes kept resting on the tree and the van in the distant heat. He chewed on a toothpick and sighed a lot. Richard sighed too, looking at the ground and all the footprints in what was supposed to be his frontier getaway. He had a feeling that his retirement was going to get even less quiet very soon. In a way, he wanted Today America to show up. He wanted to talk to someone nationally. He wanted to grab them by the ears and ask them why they cared. Who told them to give a damn? Why, of all the campfire stories in the world, did they have to be concerned about this one? He wanted to see their eyes when they realized that they didn't have an answer to that. He wanted to hear them try to rationalize about how some things just catch the national interest or how people love a mystery. He wanted to hear them explain away how this tree had the uncanny ability to draw people to it and to what? "You okay?" Whitney's voice filtered through Richard's frustration. "Yeah," he managed, unclenching his fist. "For a moment there, I almost had something." The anchorwoman looked at him with a twitch. "I know the feeling," she said. "Have you remembered anything at all yet?" "No." This time Whitney sighed. "I wonder what it wants," she whispered. "Nothing. It wants nothing. It's a damn tree." The deputy went first. Father Absalom stood with his hands clasped behind his back and a friendly smile on his face. Smoke from the fire was still trickling into the sky. The deputy didn't ask to see his hands, but tactfully waved from a distance, eliciting a wave back from the smarmy cult leader. His hands were empty. Richard wouldn't have been surprised either way. "Hold up, deputy," Richard said. The deputy looked back. "A few minutes ago there were more of them." The deputy tensed, clearly resisting the urge to look around. "How many?" he asked. "I don't know, half a dozen or so." "Okay. Stay here," he ordered. Richard didn't need telling. They'd gotten close enough to the tree when they drove the police jeep up to the cultists' camp, what Richard called the squatters' village. Richard didn't like having to drive over his land. He'd not even bought any cattle for his supposed ranch, not wanting to despoil the desert landscape that most people called ugly and wasteland to begin with. The tracks from the stupid white van the cultist had driven in there were still visible from 2 weeks earlier. This was slow country, hard to hunt but long to heal. "Morning," the deputy called out. "Well met, deputy," the cult leader smiled. "Father Absalom," Richard whispered to the professor several yards away. "Head of the cult that worships the tree. Don't let the stupid name fool you. He's got money and connections." "A real Jim Jones character," Whitney editorialized from behind them. "He's put a claim on the land and somehow gotten a judge to go along with it." "You don't say," the professor said. "Yeah," Richard groused. "On my own land. Some lawyer found an issue with the original land grant 130 years ago and claims it was never officially made available for homestead. It's BS. My lawyers say it'll never stand up, but it's still got to go through the process. Something tells me this cult is just buying time." "For what?" the professor asked. "I haven't figured that out yet. Maybe you can." "I don't see how." The deputy's hand hovered near his pistol. The unaccounted for cultists had made him nervous. Auhii County hadn't seen an Old West shootout for half a century or more. In the Mayberry towns he patrolled didn't finance training for these situations. If they were up to something, he'd be a sitting duck. In his other hand was a folded sheet of paper, a court-mandated order for a dendrochronological study of the ancient-looking olive tree on Richard's land. The age of the tree would indicate when the land had officially been brought into productivity, a vital component for all homestead cases. A smile, like rigor mortis, stayed frozen on Father Absalom's face, friendliness betrayed by the belying squint of his eyes. Aside from dirty politics, the deputy had no reason to suspect anything nefarious from the group of weirdos, but for some reason he did anyway. "I suppose you know why we're here?" the deputy asked. "Yes, sir. We know all about the study," Father Absalom beamed. "Are we going to have any problems?" "No, sir. In fact, I welcome it. It will confirm what I've been saying. This tree isn't part of the original plantation and therefore proves that this land is sacred." The deputy glanced around at the miles of beige grass and pale sage, finding it hard to believe that this land could be suitable for growing anything, much less sacred. "It's because of the river," Father Absalom said, perhaps sensing the deputy's thoughts. "Behind you." "I know where the river is," the deputy assured, not turning away. "Then you know that it's very important." "Most rivers are. Look, Father, is it? I'm not here to make judgments. If we can get on with this, we'll be out of your hair." "Is that an insult?" Father Absalom joked, his smile looking slightly more genuine as he rubbed his shaven head, glowing red with too much sun. The deputy chuckled in spite of himself. The loony sure had charm. He had to give him that. "No, sorry, just an expression," the deputy said. "So, tell me, you don't really think this thing is some sort of god?" "Yes, I do. I know it's hard to believe, Deputy. Petty. Deputy Petty. But with a little faith, it's not much stranger than your own beliefs. After all, a cracker that literally becomes flesh upon a prayer. Pretty far stretch." "Yeah, but," Deputy Petty began, but then stopped. How had the father known that? Transubstantiation and its literalness was a huge debate amongst Baptists, and as far as Petty knew, he was one of only a few in the area who believed in it. To tell the truth, he hadn't thought much about it for a long time. "You keep saying I," the deputy changed the subject. "The landowner says there were more of you around. Where are they at, Mr. Absalom?" "In the van. We don't want to be an imposition." "Uh-huh," the deputy said. "Just so long as no one tries to stop the tests." "Oh, no one will," Father Absalom said. "But it's not someone you have to worry about. It's whether the tree will let you take the sample that may be at issue. Someone's going to bleed, Whitney said to Richard. Yeah, it's like the life, Richard replied. They whispered despite being alone a dozen yards from the tree. The anchorwoman had set up a camera and left it running, so she'd do the voiceover later. She looked at Richard. How did we know that? I don't know, I think, Richard began, but a quick yelp caused him to tense. Dr. Beljovic startled and stood up. It's okay. He called from the next to the tree, where he was unpacking his gray box. These corners are sharp, he said with an embarrassed chuckle. He stuck a red finger in his mouth. Well, there's that, Richard whispered. Whitney said nothing, just frowned and turned sallow. The sun beat down hotter as it headed toward the western horizon. The sun takes a long time to set in the open expanse of high desert. Richard awaited it eagerly. Long ago, he found that the sun made it worse, the tree. Most things that kept him awake at night seemed to be lurking in the dark, but this tree... Trees love the light. It's when they're most alive. They sleep at night, just like people. Well, most people. 2 weeks earlier, he had awoke from the last good night of sleep he could remember. There was a light fog outside his new high-desert home. The term home was modest. 40 years of investing and 60 years of being mostly single had allowed him to save enough money for something similar to a mansion. He'd been surprised to find one seated halfway up a juniper and granite-covered hillside on the uninhabited face of a small Oahe mountain range. As far as mountains went, the Oahes were modest for the West, but the views of the small glacier-carved valleys at sunset were all Richard needed to be sold. He probably wouldn't have bought such an opulent house if it weren't already there. He had no idea who owned it prior, nor why they left, but it looked relatively new. He'd only been there for 3 weeks before that morning, but he'd already begun to learn the land, the animals, the weather. He knew that he could expect some powerful storm clouds to grow up against the wall of heat that the mountains lifted from the flat expanse into the sky. He knew exactly the ridge to go sit on and watch it happen, and which way the clouds would break free when they accumulated enough energy to knock down the wall of heat and go storming toward the big cities to the north. From his ridge, he'd be able to watch them hit the distant mountain range beyond those cities and dump all of his... Yes, he thought of anything that came from this land as his now. Rain in torrents upon the state capital. He thought of people clamoring to get inside, hiding under eaves and umbrellas, cowering in their homes, and frantically making hot cocoa to try and get the most out of the late spring cloudburst. The thought was a pleasant one, as long as it stayed far across the valley. He looked forward to the evening, but now he had to get working, preparing for the herd he assumed himself he was going to buy and raise. He was working on a horse stable to start with. Life was quiet and good. The mountains, the desert, the sunsets, they were a stage setting, barely animate, predictable, unwelcoming. Until, of course, he left his house and kicked his way through the mist about 200 yards down to where a tree stood. He'd been made aware of the tree by the real estate agent. She said that it was planted by the original wagon train settlers. She seemed to think it was a selling point, especially after gleefully exhibiting the old illegible names and dates carved into the bark. It looked old enough to fit the bill, gnarled and rough, but was honestly pretty unimpressive to Richard. Barely 5 feet high, it had more dead branches than live, and the few living ones only had 2 wrinkled little gray fruits hanging from them. Richard acted impressed all the same. The fruits are edible, the realtor said. That's not why they planted it, the settlers. I guess they were used as windbreaks and to distract birds from eating the crops. But I hear you can make jelly if you want. What did they grow here? Richard asked with the same cynicism that Deputy Petty would display a month later. I don't know, the realtor said. Probably nothing. That trench there, with a trickle of water, was the old irrigation ditch, but it didn't really get used. She hedged then, sizing up Richard for a second. Looking indecisive, she said, Do you like ghost stories? That misty morning, 3 weeks later, when Richard saw the tree appear out of the fog, he decidedly concluded that he did not in fact like ghost stories. He ran, called the police, and locked the doors. By the time anyone arrived, Richard had gone through the entire ghost story in his mind several times, short as it was. Russian olives weren't supposed to live very long, but this one had. Somewhere along the line, someone had realized that and come up with a stupid little story for Boy Scouts to tell around campfires. There wasn't much for local kids from the three-horse towns nearby to talk about, so they kept up the story, evolving it, making it bigger. Beyond local folklore, though, there was no reason to care about a stupid old haunted tree, whether it was used as an Old West hanging tree or not. And there was no reason to fear the ghosts of the probably make-believe hanged outlaws who died there. Or so Richard thought. But they were on that morning. 3 dead bodies, canvas-bagged heads, hanging from a fully bloomed Russian olive tree in the early morning mist. The ghosts of 3 Old West outlaws had come back for revenge from beyond the grave. Richard had watched them from the big window as he waited for the police to arrive. To his surprise, the first car to come flying up the dirt road wasn't a police car. It was a big white van with a retracted broadcast antenna on top and a big blue 5 on the side. I guess that's a start, Richard thought. At first he didn't like the idea of having the media running around on his land, but anxiety soon overcame his dislike of civilization, and he was just happy to have anyone nearby. After finding 3 corpses mysteriously hanging from an overgrown ghost tree, a lifetime of grumpiness is a small thing to set aside. Moments later, though, he was disappointed to find that the only person inside the van was a diminutive bleach blonde with a hasty makeup and a blazer over a pair of sweatpants. It may have been sexist, but Richard had at least wanted a burly cameraman with tattoos and a backwards cap to step out next. Unfortunately, the local news station didn't have the kind of money for cameramen and anchorwomen. It was a one-person gig. "Hey, grab that case," the anchorwoman demanded as she unloaded a heavy-looking camera and started uncoiling wires. "Whitney Whittle," she introduced herself as Richard complied. "You call in the hangings?" "I did. I own this land. How'd you get here so fast?" "Coming out of Grandview, and I heard the scanner. You are Richard. Good to meet you. So, what are you thinking? Murder? Suicide? Is it racism? Hangings, you know. We've had the Aryan nations in this state, you know." She spoke quickly, like the city people Richard had come here to avoid. "Yeah, I know," he said, "and I'm not in a position to speculate. Well, let's get to it before we lose this lighting. I love the fog. How many did you say there were?" Richard tensed, not knowing whether he should be talking about this or not. He'd never been at a crime scene before. He figured it couldn't hurt. What did he have to hide? 3, though I can't tell the race. I think it might have something to do with this story I heard. Ghost story. "Whoa, stop talking," Whitney smiled. "I gotta get this on camera." Richard sighed and flushed. Was he seriously going to tell all this to a news reporter? Hell no, he wasn't. "Just come with me. Bring that," he said, pointing to the camera. Briskly, he started walking across the misty field. The fog had lessened to ground cover as the long shadows shortened with the rising sun. Almost immediately, the 3 bodies could be seen hanging from the tree in the distance. Richard had to admit the lighting and the mist did make for a very striking scene. Whitney oohed and started rolling the camera. "Sure you don't want to wait for the police?" Richard asked. "Oh, I'm sure. They'll have this place locked down tight. Besides, whoever did this is probably long gone, unless it was you." She glanced furtively at Richard. He rolled his eyes. "Hey, I called the police, remember?" he said. "I'm not a counting criminal, but I'd know better than that." "Well, I'm packing, just for the record," she replied, patting a purse slung around his shoulder. Richard rolled his eyes again. Like a cat stalking its prey, the pair approached the tree. Richard was leading, trying to follow his previous tracks as much as possible to avoid disturbing any evidence. He'd watched some television, after all. Whitney continued to film. She dragged the power cables as far as it would go, then disconnected and went on batteries alone. She panted and stumbled under the weight, but held the camera rigid still with every step. The three bodies swayed listlessly in the morning breeze, their hands tied behind their backs. They each wore plain, rough-woven clothes from some natural fiber, and had canvas bags tied over their feet just like over their heads. Odd angles jutted out beneath the clothing and canvas, as though they each had several broken bones. That part wasn't in the ghost stories. "So you claim this tree just grew up overnight?" Whitney asked. A silent reverence that Richard didn't realize he was feeling fell away like a church sermon being interrupted by a fart. "No," he said, rather more harshly than he intended. "The tree's been here for years. It just grew bigger. There are more leaves, and it's taller." "Overnight?" Whitney repeated. "Yeah, I guess. You don't seem sure. What can you tell me about the story of the hanged outlaws?" Richard cleared his throat. "That's pretty much it. Bad guys robbed wagon trains, got hung, came back for vengeance every few years, or on Halloween, or on full moons, depending on who you ask. Ridiculous. And yet," Whitney gestured to the tree. "Hey, you know what? Maybe we should just wait for the police." And that was the last thing Richard remembered saying. He felt a sudden rush of energy starting at his feet, like he was soaking up caffeine by standing in a pool of it. When it reached his head, he was overwhelmed by 100 strange emotions at once. He simultaneously wanted to run in terror from the grisly scene before him and jump up to hug one of the corpses. He looked over to the anchorwoman who was staring back at him. Her hands shook. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Then his mind swirled into a defensive amnesia, trying to force order into a disintegrating reality. There was the faint memory of Whitney yelping in surprise, and a nightmarish illusion of the body on the far left suddenly jolting and writhing in its bonds. Several loud popping sounds echoed. The memory of being a teenager and finding his dad's stash of dirty magazines played through his mind. These things were only flashes in the periphery of his consciousness, figments, waking dreams intermingled with nothingness. The next thing he remembered was the flicker of blue and red lights and the murmur of voices approaching. He gasped for air as though he had just come up from a deep dive. He was standing where he had been before the blackout, unmoved. Whitney was still there too, but her camera was on the ground, and she held a small .32 automatic pistol in her hand. Streaks of makeup ran from her eyes like she'd been crying, though she didn't seem to be then. The slide of the pistol was locked back, the chamber empty. Richard looked down at the glinting brass all around her feet. Saying nothing, she followed his eyes, clearly surprised to be holding the gun. Richard never felt so alive. As the sound of voices grew with the approach of the police, barking dogs in tow, Whitney suddenly dropped down and started collecting the empty brass. "What the hell?" she muttered, stopping to feel around in her pockets. She gave Richard a derisive, hateful look, tinged with confusion, and went back to collecting the shells. "They can't find these." Richard nodded to nobody. He looked down and saw dried blood in his fingers. He traced its path to a subtle sting on his palm. He stuck his hand in his pocket to hide it. He didn't know why. Maybe something from the memory of those crime shows on TV warned him about leaving DNA, he reasoned. When the police arrived, they were too distracted by the 3 noosed corpses to catch either his or the reporter's odd behavior. Whitney stuffed the shells into the pocket of her sweats, picked up the camera, and silently started filming. "They're completely made of sticks," a laconic detective said to Richard. They were backed by the Evening 5 news van, Richard having received a scolding for possibly tampering with a crime scene. News anchors were not investigators, he was told, no matter how much they think they are. He'd agreed and apologized, but heard little else the police said until the detective told him about the sticks. "What's that now?" Richard replied. "The corpses. They're not real. I think you've been pranked. They're mannequins made from someone's yard clippings. Very convincing, though. I don't blame you for being alarmed." "Honestly?" Richard said. "We found these." The detective held up a plastic evidence bag with bunched-up white cloth inside. Richard looked closer. It was a pair of women's underwear. Not the sexy kind, but sensible, well-worn panties. Richard squinted and looked at the detective. "Probably some country girl looking to kick the religious habit," the detective said. "We could run forensics on them," he said. "But this isn't the kind of thing the county would consider serious enough to finance. Basic trespassing, petty vandalism." He paused, looking dubious. "How far we want to push this?" Richard waved his hand as if to rid himself of a fly. "Yeah, I hear you," he said. "We're wrapping up here. We'll hold the mannequins in evidence for a week, but I don't expect to find anything." "Fine. I'd suggest maybe getting some cameras installed." "Sure. Let us know if you need anything." "Will do. Thanks." Richard wasn't listening anymore. The cut on his hand was starting to hurt, and he wanted to get Bactine on it as soon as possible. First, though, he got up and walked to the back of the Evening 5 news van, where Whitney was supposedly running back the footage on the film. He peered into the dark interior, eyes slow to adjust, and knocked. "What did you do to me?" Richard recoiled as the anchorwoman's tear-stained face jutted out of the darkness. Anger radiated from her, and Richard stepped back. "What?" he asked, hands up in defense. "Was this your plan? You roofied me. I'll have you jailed for this," she rasped, just low enough not to be heard by the police milling about. "What are you talking about? What's on the tape?" "It's not on tape, stupid. It's digital. And you know what I'm talking about. Rapist." "Whoa, whoa," Richard pleaded, leaning in. "I'm as confused as you are about what happened, but I know I didn't do that." "Uh-huh, right. I didn't." "Trust me, you did," she yelled. Richard didn't ask for clarification. "And I'm getting DNA to prove it. Then you're finished." She was crying again. "You do that," Richard said, and stormed back to his house in confusion. The first phone call came from a Portland internet news company only 2 days later. They asked Richard if he had anything official to say about the tree. Richard didn't know what they were talking about and said so. He hadn't heard from Whitney Whittle since the incident in the van, and he was honestly starting to worry. The news company gave him an internet address and a phone number to call back. He threw the number in the trash. The internet address, however, took him to a video sharing website where his name featured prominently atop a banner next to the words, "Haunted Tree, can anyone explain this?" It had over 3 million views and was posted by someone named WW5. Richard hit play. The back of his head popped up on the screen, walking away from the camera and towards a tree in the distance where 3 wooden corpses swayed in the breeze. The camera followed, Whitney Whittle's disembodied voice asking dumb questions about ghosts and outlaws. Richard turned, and they had the brief conversation that he remembered having only just a couple of days prior. But when he got to the sentence,
"Maybe we should wait for
the audio stopped and the camera cut. Video came back, and it seemed that the camera had been placed on the ground, its view mostly obscured by sagebrush. The video cut, the camera view jostled, and the trunk of the tree clearly came into view. Richard watched in amazement as limbs and vines sprung from the trunk of the tree and grew like one of those nature documentaries with time-lapse. A Mormon cricket, ebony and sleek, trundled across the branch of the sagebrush, while the tree grew and twisted behind it. The video stopped, and white words in all capitals asked, "Real-life X-File? Any explanation?" Below the question, there was an email address. Richard scrolled down the page. Good CGI, but the frame rate jumps. Cuts give it away, calling hoax on this one. The first comment read, "Proof that evolution is a lie. He is in control of the world. Read your Bible, people," said the second. It had 342 replies. He clicked on them and then hit the back button when a block of text longer than most books popped up. The third comment said, "As a professional videographer, this looks pretty legit. Why all the cuts, though? Questions credibility." Richard rolled his eyes. Is this what passes for viral nowadays? Boring. Richard stopped reading and closed the browser, his mind drifting back to the tree, the way it often did. The writhing vines and branches had sent a new wave of fear through him, like when he'd first seen the corpses. He knew exactly what that writhing looked like. It looked like how he felt moments before losing consciousness. A slow shiver crept up his spine. How can something look like a feeling? Suddenly, the desert heat felt too cold for comfort, the spacious house too big. He dug the phone number of the internet news company out of the trash can and stared at it. He crumpled it up and threw it back. He knew who had the answers.
Okay, fine, you didn't do it,
Whitney said through the phone. Obviously, Richard replied. But what made you change your mind just out of curiosity? She didn't answer for a second. The sound of uncertain sighs came through the receiver several times.
Something's really wrong with that tree, Richard. I think you should get out of there.
There was only frankness and fear in her voice. I'm not leaving my house because of some pranksters, Richard said.
Pranksters? You think that's what happened? We were pranked out of 6 minutes of time? You're delusional, Richard.
Speak for yourself.
I mean it, Richard. There's someone else there, somewhere. I don't know where or who, but you're not alone out there.
Richard shuddered. That thought scared him more than anything so far. Someone. A real person. A fear more tangible than ghost stories and pranks. He looked around his vast kitchen into the living room. All the windows were open, lights off, shadows everywhere. Silence rang. Were the doors even locked?
Richard?
Yeah?
There's more to the tape than what I put online. What sound?
Oh, yeah? And by the way, thanks for putting my name on that. I didn't expect it to spread so fast. It seemed to have touched a nerve with a lot of people.
Yeah, it did. I'm no techie, but I know 3 million views in 2 days is insane. So what's missing?
Maybe you could be a real internet celebrity if you put the rest online, Richard snarked. Then suddenly he remembered Whitney's claims to rape, her claim that there was someone else there. He could guess what was on the video and suddenly regretted his choice of words. Sorry.
Sorry? You're on it too.
What's that mean?
What's your email? I'll send it.
She sounded unsure. Richard gave her his email and hung up. The beep of the phone echoed in the descending loneliness, and Richard felt an ominous feeling that he likened to an animal being hunted. A foreboding clock ticked on the wall. Should he get his shotgun? He began to get up. Silence shattered with a booming sound of knuckles on his front door. Richard jumped and may have even yelped, though he wasn't sure. He steadied himself and went to the living room. There was a large white van framed in the picture window, and to his surprise, it didn't have Evening 5 News painted on its side. He went to the door. "Good afternoon," said the bald man in white standing behind it. "My name is Father Absalom. Should have gotten my shotgun. Richard mused 2 weeks later, watching Dr. Beljovic laboriously twist the stainless steel tree core into the trunk of the olive. "What's that?" Whitney asked. "Nothing. Just wishing I'd headed this whole thing off 2 weeks ago. Could have had that tree down and into the burn pile by now, instead of having the damn thing on the verge of legal protection." He said the last 2 words in the same derisive tone that farmers used when discussing endangered snails that kept them from quality irrigation water. So this is how it felt. "Did you watch the video?" Whitney asked. Richard paused, then replied, "Yep." "And?" He felt like blushing, not looking towards the anchorwoman, but knowing she was blushing as well. "Is it real?" he asked. She paused, then said, "Yes, it is, unfortunately." Richard didn't doubt it, but he had hoped for a moment that it was all a joke, that maybe that pretty boy from TV would jump out and tell him he'd been punked or something. "How are you?" he asked. She hesitated, and in a tone which was unusually cool considering the gravity of the statement, she said, "I'm pregnant." Richard choked on nothing. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about." "But there was no one else there. There can't have been," Richard said. "I know." I hate to interrupt myself, but it is important that I tell you something. Do not stray from the path. That sound you heard, what made it is out there in these woods, and it wants you to stray. So stay with me. The light from my lantern will keep it at bay for a little while. Sometimes you may hear voices out there in the darkness. Here, if you listen close, we can hear what they have to say.
Want to give that little goblin on your list something special this season? Chilling Tales for Dark Nights makes a wonderful gift. So go to chillingtalesfordarknights.com/tour and give the gift of Chilling Tales this season. Turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
It's important to listen to those voices. They can be very helpful if you truly hear what they have to say.
Yes. Listen to us. We have much to tell you.
Now that voice you must be wary of. It will lie to you. It will try to find your darkest fears and use them against you. Its goal is to divert you. So when you hear that voice, you must focus on the path. Focus. Focus on me. Here, let me continue the story and let's not dwell here. Two weeks prior, Richard realized that he was really beginning to feel his age. A half hour of hammering at the keyboard, and he'd barely been able to get the video file opening. "What the hell is buffering?" he grumbled. A small movement caught the corner of his eye. Smoke? He jumped up and rushed to the picture window. Sure enough, there was a trail of smoke drifting into the sky. He rushed outside and toward the field where he could see the cultist white van parked under the tree. There were several of them, more than he thought could fit in the van, all bustling around the trunk. Two of them were on their knees, bowing to it like tribal voodooists in an old racist action movie. Another one, the one calling himself Father, had started a small fire in a ring of stones. Unbelievable, Richard shouted. He told them they could look at the tree, since their leaders seemed so earnest, but he never said anything about starting a fire. This wasn't the worst time of the year for open flame in the desert. That'd be in a couple of months from then. But there never was really a good time for it. He took a step to go tell them to get lost when a noise came from inside his house. It sounded like several loud pops. He turned and listened. The computer was glowing from across the room, a light flickering against the wall behind it. The video had begun to play. The popping stopped, and another sound grew louder, moaning out of the speakers. Richard squinted. It was the sound of sex. His first thought was that Whitney had sent him porn as a joke. Glancing at the cultists, he waved his hands in annoyance and went back inside, cheeks red. The moans and grunts from the speakers rose in earnest until he reflexively looked around, just to make sure no one else was around to get the wrong idea. Then he sat down and enlarged the video. The progress bar showed halfway through, so he started it over. It started from where the internet version had first cut out, with the camera on the ground, the sagebrush blocking the view, and a tree trunk writhing in the back. A scuffle off-screen sent up a plume of dust and jerked the camera around until Richard could see his own left leg from the waist down, standing motionless against the sky, fingers of his left hand dangling from the top of the screen. More dust blew in from off-screen. A shadow moved across the ground. A brief gasp of surprise came from somewhere, and the rasping metal sound of a bullet being locked into a chamber sounded. Richard saw himself move, lunging forward toward the camera until only his toe was visible. It looked like he was struggling with something or someone. The loud pops that caught his attention sounded again. Gunshots. The half-memory of the loud popping from those confusing moments came back, sounding just like Whitney Whittle's 32 on the computer speakers. Tinkling brass shells fell and disappeared into the dirt. He fought off the fear that maybe he had attacked Whitney Whittle. Maybe she'd tried to protect herself, but was just a bad shot. When the shooting stopped, Richard saw himself walk backwards across the frame, stopping exactly where he had stood before, except that blood now dripped from his fingers. Had he been shot? Grazed? He paused the video and held his hand up to the light. The bright red wound wasn't a bullet wound. It looked like the flesh of his palm had been pinched, as if perhaps he had grabbed the top of the slide on the semi-automatic pistol. Whoever she'd been shooting at, he'd tried to prevent it. He hit play. Nothing happened for a few moments, until the soft sounds of coitus began filtering through the speakers once again. A shadow occasionally flitted across the display. The moans grew louder, more dust drifted. Then with a lurch, the camera jostled again like it had been kicked. Now the trunk of the tree could be seen again, the vines just beginning to grow and twist. Richard saw his whole lower body now in view of the camera. In his right hand he was holding the white panties that the detective had showed him later that day. Signs of arousal were clear in his jeans. "Oh my God," he groaned as he watched himself. Whatever was going on off-screen clearly wasn't rape. The distinct sound of consensual sex escalated into a crescendo. Along with the sounds of female satisfaction had emerged the dry, rattling sound of a distinctly male grunting. It wasn't a sound like anything Richard had ever heard before. It was terrifying, lecherous, and unnatural. Seconds later, it was over. The dust stopped drifting, the sounds died away. Richard saw himself drop the underwear behind the sagebrush just as the shadow moved again over the camera. The shadow shrank towards the tree, moved up to it. Air flooded out of Richard's lungs and his mouth dried. Weak hands involuntarily fell away from the computer desk. His bladder loosened to within inches of embarrassment, and fear, shivering, helpless terror, drained him of anything but the ability to quake and whimper. A foot came into view. It stepped in front of the tree trunk just as another like it rose up to find purchase amidst the writhing bark and vines. They were wrapped in plain, rough canvas, tied at the ankle, and they climbed the tree and disappeared, replaced by a slow, swinging shadow, swaying and twitching in the breeze. The video stopped. Richard fainted. "I've been thinking about it," Richard said, still not looking at Whitney Whittle, still staring in mock focus at the doctor at his work. "It was a prankster. Someone was in disguise in the tree when we showed up. They used some kind of smoke, vapor or something to make us forget, and then escaped when the police weren't looking. That has to be it. I mean, God knows you weren't made pregnant by a tree or an outlaw ghost. Maybe because I didn't know what they were up to, I tried to stop you from shooting them when you drew your gun. I don't know." Whitney didn't point out any of the flaws in that hypothesis. She didn't have to. She'd considered that and tried desperately not to discount it. "God, I hope so," she said. Dr. Adnan Beljovic heard the crackling first and prayed that he hadn't really screwed up by using the 10mm core rather than the 7 like he originally intended. It was risky business, drilling into old trees. Poor sterilization itself had caused the death of more than one ancient treasure. He'd always been careful, but the bark on the olive was softer than he expected, the wood harder. It almost felt like he was drilling into an eastern oak rather than a dry western olive. He honestly didn't know how it would react to the drill. The tree cracked again, louder this time, from deep inside the trunk, audible enough for everyone to hear. Father Absalom gasped, then squealed like a child on Christmas morning. "It begins," he shouted, putting his arms up in the air and looking to the sky reverently. With a bang, the back doors of the white van burst open and half a dozen sweating cultists in white bustled out, rushing the tree. Dr. Beljovic barely had time to register that they were holding ropes and assault rifles before the tree cracked and gradually began to split open. A fissure appearing in its side like it were a balloon slowly bursting. The doctor detected a scent of earthy decay and warm air gushing from the split briefly, before he felt the hands of many frantic cultists grab a hold of him and toss him roughly into the dirt several yards away. Deputy Petty fought his natural inclination to draw his pistol at the onrush of fanatics, knowing that he was outmatched, but years of police training made it impossible not to grab for his belt. 2 searing blows to the gut were followed by 2 loud reports from a rifle, and he fell into the sagebrush, holding his bleeding stomach. Whitney screamed, and Richard, heroic despite himself, stepped in front of her, putting his hands up toward the cultists. Father Absalom hadn't changed positions or lowered his hands. He now spoke in a voice reminiscent of big-top cable preachers. "It begins, brothers and sisters. It is the dreams have foretold to me. The voices have spoken. The echoes of the past have rang in my humble ears. It begins again. The cycle of our world is unavoidable, as it is holy, brothers and sisters." Richard stood, frightened, but couldn't help but notice that there were only brothers. There were no sisters. Moreover, most of them were pasty white and looked to have spent more time in cubicles than at altars. Razor burns still prickled on the head of the crackpot holding a gun to Richard and Whitney. What a pathetic cult, Richard thought. I'm going to get killed by a bunch of nerds. "As we have all seen," Absalom continued to bellow, "coming fractured, unwelcome through our modern minds, broken by this time and place, souls out of a world past and future, as we all have seen, subjects to ancient gods against our will and to our honor. as we have all seen in our weak minds made strong through their own perversions, holy perversions to the primitive forces, as we all have seen in our darkest hours, as the poles shift, as it wakes again, the giver of life, the holiest of spheres, as we have all seen the cycle begins again. Let us be catalysts and forever be in the energy of this cycle. Let the stars above witness the glory of what it has achieved in us, the glorious pinnacle of its perversions. Richard wouldn't make sense of any of the babble. He watched the tree as it ceased to move, a great cleft, exposing a black cavity as though the center of the tree, which should have been little more than a shrub, had rotted out and left a hole down to its roots. The bald cultist, pointing the gun at Richard, lowered the barrel and turned around toward Father Absalom. All the others did the same. Their faces didn't show any happiness or expectation or fear. If anything, they showed resignation, maybe even relief, like someone who'd awoken from a bad dream and knew it was finally over. Dr. Beljovic had used the distraction to crawl to the police jeep and covertly slip inside. The door had been left open, for which he was grateful. He pushed himself onto the seat and found the radio on the dash. The preponderance of buttons momentarily daunted him, but he knew he only had to call for help. He pushed the button on the speaker and spoke the lines he'd seen so many times on serial police dramas. Deputy down, requesting backup. Static hissed back, and a feminine voice, all business, replied,
Report location.
I don't know exactly. I'm with Deputy Petty. He's been shot.
Copy. Reinforcements en route, the voice said.
A metallic rasp and snap caught his attention. One of the cultists had heard the static and was pointing his gun directly at the doctor. Dr. Beljovic braced for the worst. Do not fire, Father Absalom said, looking back at the jeep. They needn't be carried with us as unchosen baggage. They are not of its holy mind. Let them bear witness. With that, the cultists, bearing the ropes, flung them over the branches of the tree and began tying knots into the dangling ends. With blank stares and expert nimbleness, they produced a half-dozen nooses. Then, to the horror of the uninitiated, they slipped their heads in the nooses one at a time, and the remaining members of the group pulled them up individually, slowly, until they hung dancing in the air above the swirling dust. One by one this happened, the spectators not daring to move to stop it, and too entranced by the horror of it to look away. The raising of the squirming bodies became slower, more labored, more agonizing as the numbers of those living dwindled. No, not living, Richard realized. Just unhung. All the bodies hanging from the tree were still living, the squirming and dancing resuming only moments after it stopped, more frantically than before. He honestly didn't know if it was just the slow death of a gentle hanging, or the preternatural energy that surrounded the tree itself. Finally, only Father Absalom was left. He smiled serenely at the spectacle before him. "You evil lunatic!" Whitney burst out. "Why the hell are you doing this?" She rushed over to where the wounded deputy lay groaning in the dirt and drew his pistol, pointing it directly at the cult leader. Assault rifles littered the ground around the tree, but if the father had any intention of using them, he didn't show it. "You will understand soon," he said, wet eyes carrying his unsteady gaze toward her. "You are part of it now. It is in you, though truly it is in all of us. But you carry it." He pointed toward her midsection. "What are you talking about?" Whitney asked in a weak voice. "You know. It has told me. It tells me many things because it loves me. But you will understand soon. It begins again." With those words, Father Absalom turned and walked toward the division in the tree. He glistened with the sweat of exertion from heaving the final cult member into the air on his own, but he walked with a light step. The men hanging from the tree continued to squirm and dance. As he crossed into the shadow of the empty tree, Father Absalom seemed to sink into the earth. "Where are you Richard began, but a feeling came over him, beginning at his feet. He felt tired, exhausted, as if he'd run a marathon and stayed awake for 6 days. It was exactly the opposite of the feeling from 2 weeks ago. Then he remembered nothing. Richard came to with a gasp, heard Whitney and the doctor's sharp intake of breath nearby as they awoke simultaneously. There was no telling how much time had passed, but none of them had moved. The corpses hanging from the tree only swayed in the breeze. Richard gathered his senses. Despite feeling like he could use a nap, the feeling of tiredness had gone away. "How's Cop?" he asked weakly. "Alive," Whitney replied after resuming her inspection. "But barely." "Help is on the way," Dr. Beljovic said, reclining in the driver's side of the jeep. "Should we cut him down?" Richard asked, pointing to the hanging cultists. "To hell with them," Whitney said. Richard started to protest, but then a face peered from the shadow of the crack in the tree. It was Father Absalom. From his expression, Richard could tell that something was wrong. He didn't look pleased. Confusion shifted to anger, then to despair. The would-be priest thrust his arms back out of the trunk, grabbing onto the rough bark along the fissure. "No!" he gasped. "It's gone! She's gone! Why?" Richard stepped forward, but then stopped. He expected to see the bald man, entwined in vines, get violently pulled back into the tree, screaming and gasping like in a B-horror movie. But that didn't happen. Slowly, almost painfully, Father Absalom emerged from the shadows. His feet were black with wet soil, tears streaming down his face. He collapsed to the ground in the sun, whimpering. "No love," he said, and then repeated, "No love, no love, nothing. Why is there nothing?" Richard went towards him. The sound of a helicopter approached. Father Absalom looked at Richard with more honesty in his expression than he ever had before. "It left," he sobbed. "She cares nothing. Not love, not even hate. Worse, I was not accepted." He looked back at the darkness inside the tree. "Not even rejected. Ignored." Despite everything, Richard felt the urge to kneel on his side and comfort the crying man, but he didn't. What could he say? He didn't even know what the maniac was babbling about, and he had just murdered 6 people. So Richard just stood there and listened to the helicopter getting louder. With a crack, one of the branches broke. The men, hanging at the furthest end, fell to the ground, tree branch atop them. Another crack, and the other men dropped with a sickening crunch. Leaves fluttered to the ground in an autumn-like cascade. "What's happening?" Richard asked Father Absalom, but the sniveling cult leader didn't respond. He turned to the doctor in the jeep, but Dr. Beljovic had climbed out and was waving to an approaching medical helicopter. Whitney had dropped the pistol and was putting pressure on Deputy Petty's wounds. Richard alone watched the tree die. Father Absalom cried to himself, "Give up! We are as rocks, dirt. There is no sanctuary in the life of man. It comes despite us. Give up! It is coming!" Richard kicked him. Whitney Whittle lay on her couch, recovering from the procedure. The reproductive clinic was just across the street from Deputy Petty's hospital room, and Richard had driven back for a visit after her, dropping her off. Despite it all, she felt a twinge of guilt. The doctor had said that the fetus would never have survived anyway, given the extent of its apparent disfigurements, but she wasn't so sure. She'd never been pro-choice, but in her head she knew that she had done the right thing. The phone rang and she answered it. It was work.
Hey, got a scoop for you. You feeling up to a trip?
I might be soon. What's the gig? It had been a long week and she was happy to get her mind back on her job.
Looks like another viral video like the tree. This one's in England.
I'm going to stop you right there.
Now hold on. I know you're still a little off from that whole crazy shootout thing, but that's what makes you the resident expert. King 6 requested you personally.
Whitney hesitated. King 6? Regional?
National even. What do you say?
Give me the link. I'll check it out, but no promises.
It's already in your inbox.
The video had a voiceover with a Cockney tinge. It told of an ancient figure called Green Man, a fairy kind of creature that represented the spirit of nature. It then went on to tell of how yew trees were sacred and that the particular tree in the video had a special history of being home to the Green Man entity. Most thought it was ancient superstition, but now the branches and vines twisted into the visage of a wise old man that made Whitney think of the wizards from Tolkien's fantasy sagas. The Green Man looked placidly around the acorn eyes as the foliage pulsated. The video had 2 million hits and climbing, and Whitney could see why. She felt a strong surge of something energizing as she watched it, like an after-workout slump being broken by a rush of endorphins. The video zoomed out. In the background, there were people dressed in robes with leaves in their hair. They stood in a circle, awkwardly chanting something that sounded like it came straight out of Middle-earth. One of them, in the middle, was pregnant. The pagans had started to gather. Whitney scrolled down. A new video had been posted. The title read, Tulpa Tree. Buddha effigy appears under banyan. Must see. This one took place in India. The still frame featured a pixelated image of a fat man made of leaves and branches, sitting serenely under a tree. Whitney exited the browser and shut off her computer with trembling hands. She wasn't going anywhere. She wouldn't have to. Pretty soon, the whole world would know that it was here. Well now, it looks like we have not only reached the end of our story, but also the end of our journey. You see that fork in the road up there? Well, that is where we're going. Now, it is time for you to make a choice. You see, when we do not respect the boundaries we experience in life, be they real or imaginary, we often end up paying the price for trespassing. And the hard part to comprehend is we don't always know when we've trespassed. Like the poor, unfortunate souls in the story, you may not deserve to be where you are, but that don't change the fact you're here. So, do you dwell on the fear you feel for what's to come, or do you release yourself from it and move on? Seems like the followers from the story would have been wise to have answered that question in a different way.
Don't you see? If your employers had not been greedy and destroyed those trees and threatened that land, you would still be breathing. They are the reason you are dead.
Don't listen. Dwelling on your separation is what he wants. He wants you to sew yourself to that world you are no longer a part of. Look into your heart, and you know what happened. Had to happen. We may not understand, but we are part of something much larger than we know. But the choice is yours now. I cannot interfere. You have to decide.
You have chosen.
Why do you make me listen to this? I have listened for what seems like a millennium.
Each person makes their own decisions. You are cursed to feel the results of that individual decision. Just as I am cursed to be the one to devour those who choose to stay. You know what you have done, and you will lose more of them to me. And I will stay the ruler of this plane. You cannot take from me that which is mine.
I have all eternity to prove you wrong. And you will learn that what we do is not for your glorification, but for all our benefit. You are as much as an instrument as I, and your blindness to that will be your undoing.
We shall see. We shall see.
And so ends your part in this journey. What you have witnessed may be reality, or it may be just a dream. But remember, even pleasant dreams walk in the dark. Another journey lies ahead. But that is another story.
Thank you for joining us for Walking in the Dark, starring Otis Gyrie. Series production by Jesse Cornett and Steve Taylor. Original theme composed and performed by Jesse Cornett, courtesy of Pleroma Productions. Story production, sound design, and original story scores by Ronnie Dickinson. To get more information about the performers and authors featured in this broadcast, visit simplyscarypodcast.com. This broadcast is a production of Chilling Entertainment, LLC, copyright 2016. The series was conceptualized and written by Craig Groshek and Jesse Cornett.
Chilling tales for dark nights.